I'm so grateful to be on that network and to hopefully be doing some good with the network. Caleb and Michael are doing a great job co-directing it, so from my standpoint at least, and I'm so thankful for them and so thankful for you, so thankful for your being here, and for the next few minutes, so thankful for your attention. So right now, I'm looking at a lot of people who have had a lot of success. I don't know most of you, but I would assume that there are wealthy people in this room. Most of the world would consider you successful. I would assume that I'm safe in saying that there are people in this room who are bosses in the workplace. Now, most of the world is jealous of you and either hates you or loves you, and most of the world would consider you a success. And I know that I'm safe in saying that everyone in this room is loved by someone. And in my book, that makes you a success. So right now, I'm looking at a lot of people who have had a lot of success. But even though you probably have experienced the highs of life, even though you may have newspaper clippings with your name on them, even though you may be someone whom everyone looks up to, even though you may have a spouse and children, a family who just adore you, even though you may have every material thing you could ever want, in spite of all of that, does it ever feel like something is missing? Does it ever feel like there has to be more? Do you ever feel incomplete? Because even though you probably have a lot, you don't have everything. Maybe you're single and you want so badly to be married and to have that companionship. And you just know that if that ever happened by some miracle, then you'd be happy. Or maybe you're married and you've always wanted children, but for some reason, one reason or another, it's not looking like it's going to happen. But you know that if something happened and it did happen, then you'd be happy. Or maybe you work really hard at your job, and even if you never say this out loud, in your heart of hearts, you believe that if you just got one more promotion, just got a few more digits added to that paycheck, then you'd be happy. Or maybe you're in school, and like me, you're tired of having a load hang over you all the time, and you're ready to be free. You're ready to graduate, and once you know that, like once that day comes, then you'll be happy, just like that. We all seem to be searching for something. We're searching for love. We're searching for companionship. We're searching for purpose. We're searching for identity. We're searching for something. And so often what happens with that search is that when I don't find exactly what I'm looking for, exactly when I'm looking for it, I resort to a coping mechanism. And at least for me, that coping mechanism is often what we might call the someday mentality. Now, the someday mentality says that someday I'll find Mr. or Mrs. Right. Someday I'll understand my purpose. Someday I'll find the right door and it'll open for me. Someday. But the problem with the someday mentality is that when I'm focused on someday, I miss what Jesus is offering me today. So when I have that feeling inside, when I learn to live with the feeling that just it's never going to be totally full, when I learn to live with the feeling that there's something missing, that I am incomplete, what that does is that it dramatically affects how I look at life and how I interact with other people. Because when I'm incomplete, when I'm not full, then every interaction that I have, every relationship that I have is about me. It's about meeting my needs and fulfilling my desires and filling me up. So when I live like that, when I have that mindset, it's really hard truly to love and serve other people because it's all about me. Now, every single person in the history of our planet has been incomplete on their own, except for one guy, and you probably know his name. If you're not there already, look at John chapter 1. John 1, and we're going to read verse 14, beginning. John 1, verse 14. This is speaking about Jesus. It says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And now, if you're I think the ESV does this. If your translation doesn't, you might, in your mind, put a parenthesis around this phrase and the end of this phrase. And we beheld His glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father. Now, in parentheses, full of grace and truth. So that's a parenthetical statement in the middle of this verse. So if you read it without the parenthetical statement, we beheld His glory, glory as of the only begotten of the Father. Read it straight through. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. How? Full of grace and truth. Now, verse 15 is a parenthetical verse. Say that John bore witness of that. Parenthetical verse. So the thought continues in verse 16. And of His fullness we have all received, and grace for grace, or grace upon grace. Jesus is the only person in the history of people who was truly full. And He was full of two things, grace and truth. And what does our world need more than those two things? Because grace without truth would be a lie. You're okay. You don't have to worry about doing anything. Everything's going to be all right. But truth without grace would be a burden that we couldn't bear. You can never know you're saved. You can never be comfortable. You can never feel confident in your salvation. But Jesus was full of both. He was full of grace and truth. And He's the only person in the history of our world who has been full on His own. Now, what's really interesting is how that changes our lives. Because in verse 16, John makes something very clear. He says that we can all receive from that fullness. So even though we aren't full, we can receive from His fullness as He pours into our lives and fills us up. So this morning, as we go through and look at different interactions that Jesus had in the book of John, we're going to notice one very simple truth. He can complete me. And He can do it like no one else and nothing else ever possibly could. He completes me. Now, you might have noticed in the Bible class, if you were here, that I have an addiction to alliteration. So I like alliterating my points, so they all begin with the same letter. So we're going to do that this morning. And the first point has something to do with happiness. Okay? Then the second point has to do with husbands, and the third point has to do with healing. So let's talk about happiness. Look at chapter 2 of John. John chapter 2 should be probably just a page turnover. Here in John 2, there's a wedding going on in Cana of Galilee. And Jesus and His disciples are invited, and so they show up at this wedding, and everything is going great. They're having a great time when there's a problem. The wine runs out. Now, in that culture, this was a really big deal. This was a huge deal for the host because it was shameful. In that culture, it said to everyone who came to the party that, hey, we're too poor to afford enough to give all of you this refreshment. So, for selfish reasons, I guess, this was a really big deal in that culture. It was a shameful thing for the host. So this is a big deal for these people that are hosting this wedding. And you can just hear the grumbling of the people at this celebration. You can hear the life trickling out of the party. And everybody knows that the party needs something. But the party is, but everybody's desperately wrong about what this party actually needs. Because this party doesn't actually need, really, more wine. What this party desperately needs is Jesus. In verse 6, here in John 2, the Holy Spirit, through John, makes a point to say something that I had never noticed until studying for this sermon. He says that there were 6 water pots. Okay? I don't care if there are 2 water pots, 6 water pots, 106 water pots. Let's just get to the cool miracle, right? Comes real soon. But the number 6 is incredibly significant in the Bible because it is incredibly symbolic. And in the Bible, the number 6 represents one word: incomplete. This party was missing something. It was incomplete. We assume that it had the bride. We assume that it had the groom. It had all 6 of these water pots, but it was missing something. It was missing joy and happiness and celebration. But then here comes Jesus. Here comes just what this wedding needs. He is the 7th source. And what do you know? In the Bible, the number 7 represents completeness. So Jesus is going to complete this wedding. Jesus performs this miracle, and He, as John says here, turns water into wine. And the servants take this drink to the master of the feast. And he drinks it, and then notice what he says in verse 10 here in John 2. He says, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." The party is saved. The party is full. The party is complete. Why? Because of Jesus. So many people in our world don't have joy. They aren't happy. Why? Because they're looking to the wrong source. The water pots could only do so much for that wedding. They were imperfect. They were incomplete. They had a limit on what they could do. They were finite. And that limit was exceptionally finite. Once the liquid was gone from within them, that was it. That's all the happiness that they can provide. But then here comes Jesus, and here comes the seventh source. And it's different. So the happiness that those water pots provided is like the happiness that this world can provide. It's not that this world can't provide happiness to us, because it can. I think most of us have found happiness through worldly things. It can provide happiness. But the problem with that happiness is that it runs out. There's only so far that it can take us. Now, I'm about to throw a bunch of verses at you, and we're going to go through them really quickly, so I've got them up on the screen so you can see them. But as we go through them, I want you to notice the three things, at least the three things that I noticed, that all of them have in common. I'll go ahead and tell you the first one. They all contain the word kairo, the Greek word kairo, which was their just generic word for happiness. Okay, so they all had the Greek word kairo. See if you can notice the two other things that they all have in common. First, Matthew 5, 11 and 12. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad. There's our happiness. For your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Luke 6, 22 and 23. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil, on account of the Son of Man. Here it is, rejoice in that day, and leap for joy. For behold, your reward is great in heaven, for so their fathers did to the prophets. Acts 5, 40 and 41. And when they had called in the apostles, they beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and let them go. Then they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. Philippians 3:1 and Philippians 4:4. Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord, and rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Colossians 1:24. Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I'm filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is, the church. 1 Peter 4:13. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Last one, 2 Corinthians 6, beginning with verses 3 through 5. This section of Scripture is beautiful. Listen to it. We put no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, by great endurance in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger. Pause there. If you think about it, almost any of these things would be just about the worst thing that any of us have ever gone through, especially for the cause of Christ. Take the easiest one of these things. It's probably the hardest thing that I've ever gone through for Jesus. Paul goes through this, and he says, skipping down to verses 8 through 10, through honor and dishonor, through slander and praise, we are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying and behold, we live, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing yet possessing everything. You might have picked up on at least one of the two other things that these passages have in common. If not, it's on this screen. Suffering. Every single one of these verses said something about suffering. And we're about to go back through them. But just for a moment, think about this. The Bible seems to tell us that we should feel more happiness when we suffer and because we suffer. But how is that possible? How does that work? Because that goes against everything that's intuitive to us, right? From our perspective, the times when we suffer are the times when we should be the least happy. But remember, he completes me. Because happiness is in each of these verses. Suffering is in each of these verses. But there's something else. Matthew 5, 11 and 12. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Luke 6, 22. Blessed are you when other people hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Acts 5:41. Then they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. Philippians 3:1, finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. And I should say Paul was in prison as he was writing this. That's where the suffering comes in these verses. Colossians 1:24, now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body. That is the church. 1 Peter 4:13, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. As servants of God, we are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying and behold, we live, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing yet possessing everything. We can have happiness even when everything around us screams unhappiness, because our happiness doesn't have to depend on what's around us. Our happiness can depend on whom is above us. What we learn from this account in John 2 is that we have to quit looking to the water pots of this world. We have to quit looking to the next thing. Quit relying on the someday mentality that says, when I meet this person, or when I am this person, or when I own this thing, then I'll actually be happy. That's a someday mentality. The 6 water pots at that party were cheap. They were incomplete. They didn't last. But the 7th source was different. It was the real stuff. And he can provide the exact same thing to every single person on earth today. He is what everyone on earth is searching for. Now, let's go to John 4, and let's say something about husbands. Something about husbands. Some of y'all ladies just got a dark cloud over your face. Something about husbands. Here in John 4, Jesus shows up at this well, and then here in John 4, there's this phrase that would have made the hairs on the back of the necks of every Jew in that day stand up. John 4, verse 7. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Nothing about that sentence would have made a Jew happy. First of all, the Jews in that day, and really the entire world, looked down on women. They didn't view them as being equal to men. They didn't give them equal rights to men, so they looked down on women. But even more than that, even more than this woman was from Samaria. Now, if you know anything about the relationship of the Jews and Samaritans, you know that the Jews hated the Samaritans with everything in them. They were very racist against them. They viewed them as being half-breed Jews, and so they referred to them as dogs. Just to kind of illustrate how deep this went. This is a map of Palestine in the time of Jesus around his ministry. So if you see here at the bottom, there is Idumea, there's Judea, Samaria, Galilee. Now the Samaritans are from Samaria. Now, Jews in that day, say a Jew who's living in Judea wants to travel from Judea to Galilee. Now there's an obvious route, right? The most obvious way to go is from, let's say he lives in Jerusalem. He moves from Jerusalem straight up to Nazareth. That's the obvious route, right? But because the Jews were so racist against the Samaritans, because they hated them, they despised them, they would go from Jerusalem, cross the River Jordan, go up through Perea, up through Decapolis, and over to Galilee. Now, this might not look like a huge deal on this map, but think about it. They have no cars. They're walking or riding on donkeys. And this is adding hundreds, dozens. I mean, think about if you lived over here in Gaza, adding a long way to your trip to go around. This is like trying to go from here to Ohio and not going through Kentucky because you don't like Kentucky. It makes no sense, logically speaking. But this is what they did because they hated the Samaritans so much they wouldn't even go through their country. Now, John reinforces this point here in verse 4, or verse 9 of John 4, where he says that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. They didn't even deal with them. They didn't want to be around them. But verse 4 here in John 4 tells us that Jesus needed to go through Samaria. Why? That was against his culture. It was against his nation. It was against his race. Why would he do that? Because of this woman. I like to think that maybe Jesus had had this day circled on his calendar, as it were, since before he came into the world. He needed to go through Samaria because of her. Now, verse 6 here in John 4 tells us that it was about noon when this woman came to the well alone to get water. Now, that tells us a lot about this woman, especially when you combine it with information that we learn about her later on. You see, in that time and place, women didn't come to the well in the middle of the day, and they definitely didn't come alone. Think about it. This is the Middle East we're talking about. This is Palestine, so it's really hot in the middle of the day. It's not an ideal time to be walking up and down hills and carrying these heavy buckets of water. So they would come in the cooler parts of the day. They would come in the morning or at night, and they wouldn't come alone. They would come in groups for safety, because this is not a very safe place in the world. So that was what normally happened. They would go in the cooler parts of the day, and they would go in groups. So the fact that she's here, alone, in the middle of the day, tells us something. It tells us that she had a reputation. This was somebody whom nobody wanted around. She's not getting an invite over for Thanksgiving meal, Thanksgiving dinner. Nobody's inviting her for the Memorial Day cookout. Nobody wants her to come to the cornhole tournament, which is awesome. Nobody's like sending her a Christmas card. This is an outcast of society. Nobody wants to be around her, and she doesn't want to be around anybody. But there's someone who knew that she would be, at that exact time, there, at that exact place. And that someone asks her for a drink. And in her response, we can see some of the sexism and the racism that we were talking about. Verse 9, then the woman of Samaria said to Jesus, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? You can see some of the scars of the hatred and the bigotry in that response. It's left its mark on her. But then, here in verse 10, Jesus says something that you and I understand, but she didn't. Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Okay, so we know that Jesus is talking about spiritual things when he talks about living water. She says, how are you going to get this living water when you don't even have a bucket? You don't have a bucket to draw from the well with, so how are you supposed to get this living water? What's her problem? She's focused on the wrong thing. Jesus is trying to get her to focus on spiritual things. She is preoccupied with physical things. She says, you need a bucket. But what she doesn't get is that you don't need a bucket when you are the well. That's what Jesus is about to reveal to her. What she's about to discover is what has been missing from her life this entire time. She's been looking to the wrong well. What happens in the lives of so many people is that we go through bucket after bucket after bucket after bucket and are never satisfied because we never thought to think that maybe, just maybe, we were looking to the wrong well. That's what this lady is about to discover, is that maybe we don't need a new job or new friends or New Year's resolutions. Maybe we don't need another new bucket. Maybe what we need is a new well. Verse 18, this lady had already been through a lifetime of buckets. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This woman has been through bucket after bucket after bucket after bucket, all drawing from the same well, and apparently she still hasn't found what she's been looking for because she's on her 6th one, right? And now what she's actually been looking for this entire time is standing right in front of her, and she still doesn't get it. Verse 25, the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Why is she missing what's staring her in the face? Literally. Because she has a case of the somedays. Someday, I'll find Mr. Right. Someday, I'm going to understand everything. Someday, this guy's going to come and he's going to tell us everything that we need to know. We're going to be all okay. Someday. But then Jesus says something that's so incredibly powerful. Verse 25. The woman said to him, verse 26, I who speak to you am he. This woman has gone through person after person after person, never finding what she's looking for, never finding that fulfillment, that satisfaction, that happiness, because she's been looking to the wrong well. She's been stuck on someday for so long. And this is the moment when it hits her. Today is that day. This is the moment when she realizes that, I've tried out like 6 lowercase hymns, but now I'm standing in front of the uppercase hymn. And this is exactly who I've been looking for this entire time. He is the 7th one. And what does she do? Verse 28, she drops her bucket and she runs back into the city and she tells everyone who she can find because she found the well. She was looking for love and she found it in Jesus. She was looking for belonging and she found it in Jesus. She was looking for satisfaction, and she found it in Jesus. She was looking for companionship. She found it in Jesus. She was looking for identity. She found it in Jesus. She was looking for purpose. She found it in Jesus. She was looking for hope, and she found it in Jesus. I don't know about you, but it sounds to me like this woman has found exactly what she's been looking for. Now, the question for us is, how many buckets do we have to go through before we realize that the problem is not with the bucket? Third, look at later on in John chapter 4. Let's notice something about healing. As if that story weren't enough, later on in John 4, we have this exclamation point. Verse 46 tells us that a certain nobleman came to Jesus. Now, this nobleman was probably a Jew, but he worked for the Romans. Now, what that meant is that he was also an outcast of society to some extent, because he wasn't accepted with his people. He wasn't accepted with the Jews. He was, in effect, a traitor. He worked for the Romans, the people who were oppressing the Jews. So, he's not a very popular man. He's not accepted by the Jews. But here in this text, he runs up, and he essentially gets down on his hands and his knees, and he's begging Jesus to come heal his dying son. And Jesus says, go home, your son has been healed. And then this father, he runs home, and we can only imagine the emotions that are coursing through his body in this moment. But he doesn't even get home before his servants intercept him, and they say, hey, he's alive, your son's been healed. And then notice what this father says. I never noticed it in this context before, but verses 52 and 53. So he asked them the hour that he began to get better. And they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. The father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. 6 is incomplete. 7 is complete. This morning, I would submit to you that Jesus Christ is your 7th source. Jesus Christ is your 7th one. And Jesus Christ is your 7th hour. You probably have a lot, but you don't have everything. And friend, if you don't have Jesus, you don't have a thing. He completes me, and He would love nothing more than to complete you. If you would like to dedicate your life to Him, won't you please do it by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.